particularly for Simon for bringing us back on track on time. So we don't have to hurry. We are on track to finish, and Mary and her team get sufficient time to go through the next session. So the next session, we're going to broaden out the scope of the discussions around food, and we get to explore with Mary and a wonderful panel of experts from different sectors the scope to look at the ambitious goal of making Scotland a good food nation. It's ambitious, but it's possible. And so to take us through that panel, I'm going to introduce, first of all, Prof Mary Brennan.
Do it quickly, don't waste time.
All right, okay. Mary obviously has a very impressive CV. She has a background in Bachelor of Engineering in Agriculture and Food, followed by MSc and a PhD in Agriculture and Food Marketing, quite diverse profile there. And after having worked for years in Newcastle in various academic roles, she moved closer home to University of Edinburgh in 2013. And since joining the university here, she has taken on the role of the head of marketing group in August 2015 and has been since promoted to Professor of Food Marketing and Society in 2017. She's a food consumer researcher who explores the complex dynamic relationships people have with food, how these shape everyday food practices, underpin contemporary food policy challenges, and which are considered very resistant to change. She's also chair of the Scottish Food Coalition that several of us are part of, and has worked extensively on the newly passed Good Food Nation Scotland Act 2022, establishing and leading the Wellcome Trust funded Good Food Nation Lab in her role as the lab director. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, and I'm going to introduce, we have a panel of 3 today. Unfortunately, one of our panel members is not well, so Dr. William Cook is not able to join us. So we will be joined by Tracy McCullin, who is the lead of the Good Food Nation team at the Scottish Government and has been working tirelessly to produce the National Good Food Nation Plan. We will also be joined by Mandy Morgan, the Chief Executive of Scottish Pantry Network, who brings a really strong and nuanced third sector perspective to supporting local food provision and how that might be supported and amplified and invested in through the Good Food Nation agenda. And also Meadhbh Maguire, who is Principal Planner of Highland Council and who's going to sort of help to provoke and get us thinking about the relationship between the planning system and our good food and our good food nation and our good food environment. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to say first is I've been reflecting a lot on, and I have used, rightly or wrongly, the analogy of a journey in terms of the Good Food Nation. But of course, there probably is no destination to this journey. It's a sort of ongoing, continuous journey, but one that I think the Good Food Nation and the legislation and the process of planning that we are about to embark on in every local authority and health board in Scotland is a seminal moment in Scottish food policy history and is really going to mark a shift change and also hopefully a national conversation about food through all of the local activity and planning that is going to happen. So I just wanted to say that, and that's not meant to be negative or sort of doom and gloom, but it's about being able to understand our role, our responsibility, our part at this stage in the journey and how we can really pump prime and drive forward this pretty unique legislative opportunity and approach that Scotland is taking. So thank you very much for that. So if I invite the panel up, I'm going to have the pleasure of asking them some questions. So Tracy, Mandy and Meadhbh, if you would like to join me on stage. I will sit down, so don't worry. I won't be pottering around here. And I've been asked to make sure, can you please speak clearly into the microphone so everyone can hear. Excellent. Okay. Right, so we're nearly almost exactly 3 years since the Good Food Nation Scotland Act was passed unanimously by the Scottish Parliament on, if my memory serves me correctly, the 15th of June. I was cycling on the Wild Atlantic Way at the time, chugging up and down mountain passes in County Kerry, where I'm originally from, when I heard the news. So it feels like an opportune time to take stock and think about how this moves into the sort of local arena, but also how it connects in with, articulates to, and at times the tensions with trying to drive a greater balance across the core outcomes that Scotland is looking to achieve. And how do we balance continued economic growth with improved public health outcomes, for example, given all the discussions we've had today? So to start off with, and I think I'm going to start with Mandy, actually. I've been given free rein to decide. So just the first question that you're all going to ask is, what would you like the implementation or the journey we're embarking on the Good Food Nation to look like locally, based on your expertise and your experience in the next 3 to 5 years?
I'd like to see a Scotland where access to good food is no longer dependent on income, where communities are resourced, empowered and trusted to deliver sustainable, dignified food provision through partnership and innovation.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Maeve, can you pick up on that? And then I may pick up on a couple of things that you've mentioned.
I think very similar actually to Tracy is that I similarly would see a legislative basis for measuring success in 3 years. If we all know that national planning policy has some provisions for food, environments and health within that, but planning decisions are made by local authorities based on local development plans. In 3 years' time, what I would like to see is some local development plans taking ambitious local planning policies to assess planning decisions and to be able to make refusals and approvals on that basis. I would also like to see some changes to legislation that would recognise the diversity of the food environment that exists now, because of course the planning use class order that we use doesn't really reflect the diversity and increasingly the delivery-based models that we're now seeing that it perhaps did in the past. So that would be certainly what I would be hoping for in the next 3 years.
And Mandy, building on what you were saying, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges that this sort of journey of local planning gives us in improving local food systems and reducing food insecurity and improving dietary outcomes?
Yep, the barriers are short-term funding. The biggest challenge is for the instability of funding, and we're talking about 12 months. We need a more a better way of funding of these types of things. So, like our Pantry network, we would like to see these pantries being embedded into local communities as infrastructure. So they're set up like shops. They've got all the infrastructure of local shops, so they can be, it's not like food banks. They can be giving out healthy, fresh food, and they're all set up with all the kind of health and safety and all that comes with that as well. And so being infrastructure for government, for local authorities to be able to actually provide good food within local communities. We know that lots of local communities don't have access to good food. We know that a lot of local communities, it's corner shops that they've got, they don't have a lot of fresh food within them, and there's a lot of takeaways. And so if we've got actual infrastructure embedded in that's more than just the food as well, that it's about the employability, it's about skills development, it's about bringing communities together. So that needs funding.
Maeve, just picking up on one of the things you said, and I think it picks up on one of the points around online delivery services, because of course online delivery is no longer just out of home, is it? It's just a whole new way of provisioning food for some groups. How do you see, both in your expertise, in your area in planning and the relationship with the Good Food Nation, being able to sort of maintain pace with and be agile and responsive to sort of different models of food provisioning, different ways of eating, and the impact that that has on our dietary outcomes?
That's a big question to unpack.
And she didn't get that one in advance.
Oh, no. But I'm willing to take that one on. I mean, honestly, the planning,
I thought you might.
The planning system has to balance the development of land in the long-term public interest. That is its purpose. So there's various interests and groups and new agendas that will come into the policy framework for us to consider. And our policies don't often change as quickly as the events around us. So there's often a lag between what we're confronted with and the tools that we actually have to make decisions. At the present time, we are very fortunate to have National Planning Framework 4, which is an up-to-date national provision. Local development plans in Scotland are currently being produced by local authorities across the country. But I suppose to answer your question, sorry, just repeat the second part of your question again.
I think it's the keeping pace with the sort of changing lifestyles, changing business models, changing ways of provisioning food.
Yes. So in that regard, we have planning policies, there's the lag, but then we also have planning legislation, which, depending on which specific type of legislation you're reading, there could be quite a significant lag. So the Planning Act is relatively recent, but actually some of the decisions that are made are on the basis of legislation that's in fact far older. At the current time, we are using very limited numbers of what are called planning use classes to determine whether this is an appropriate development for a certain location. We're using retail, which is retail for everything. So there is no distinction between food and non-food, and there is certainly no distinction then even further for healthy food. So planners are simply not considering that aspect when they're looking at a retail application. We then have food, which is restaurants and cafes, again, no distinction, and hot food takeaways. And the distinction in those is where food is for consumption on or off the premises. So again, our focus is very narrow in what we're actually looking at. It doesn't enable us to fully engage with the wider debates around health, with obesity, with the content of food. But even then, as narrow as those three categories are, I don't think that fully reflects the reality. A lot of restaurants are also hot food takeaways in a lot of Scottish towns. And we have to make a judgment as to which is the dominant use. And there's not the resources to enforce that. So if, for example, there's a restrictive policy for hot food takeaways, but the unit provides enough seating to also be classed as a restaurant, then we get into the debate where can we take enforcement action if it is in fact, for all purposes a takeaway, and do authorities have the ability to do that? So it's an extremely challenging context to try and use out-of-date tools for evolving problems. But of course, the issue for delivery-based models, which are really emerging, is that they are essentially using land in quite a different way. The way that transport interacts with the environment is very important in planning. And if a land use class is generating significant amounts of trips and travel, is that a compatible development to be placed within a very sensitive residential area? These are things that they exist now, but our planning legislation doesn't fundamentally see it as a different thing, and that has to be updated in order to make better decisions.
Fascinating. So that's really interesting about both the value and importance of legislation, but also the challenges of using it in the way that we are for the outcomes we're looking for, but also, as you say, enforcement, and that's come out in a number of the discussions around the challenges around you might develop quite an elaborate policy and regulatory mechanism, but then actually enforcing it and the different forces that are lobbying or operating against it. Really, really interesting. Mandy, I just wanted to pick up before we move on to the next question. I know you have some interest in relation to public procurement and public food. So where do you, drawing from your expertise on the front line, what role do you see public food playing in delivering a good food nation?
So we are an organisation, we have our own farm project, and our farm project is within another local authority. So we are within Glasgow, our farm project is within Eastern Bartonshire. And that is causing us some issues, so that crossover between getting funding, so the farm project, the food that's going to come off the farm is going to fund go into Glasgow, so Eastern Bartonshire doesn't want to pay for it. And the food is being grown in Eastern Bartonshire, so Glasgow doesn't want to pay for it. And so we're having a bit, but there's a bit there of, as well as procuring that. So there's through the food policy partnership that we've got in here in Glasgow, because our food plan is quite well advanced, and I see some people here who have been involved in that. They're doing a wonderful job. And so, there's a whole lot of growing projects who want to get involved and being able to procure, and because they're such small-scale organisations, that's becoming a challenge. So we're looking at some sort of bringing all those kind of groups together so that we can procure together. But yeah, procurement is becoming a problem to get the kind of a locally grown, locally sourced food out there.
Okay, so there's a lot of will and a lot of interest, but actually some of the infrastructure and the models and the ways of doing it. Brilliant. So on the second question, I'm going to break it up into opportunities and then barriers. So, well, actually, let's start about barriers and then we'll finish on opportunities. So thinking from your perspective, Maeve, opportunities. And for delivering a good food nation locally, what do you see as the main opportunities?
Well, the main opportunities are, if local authorities produce their next local development plans, which will be the documents which for the next 10 years determine how they determine the future of land within their authority, they can come up with strong planning policies which enforce the good ones in National Planning Framework 4. We can protect prime agricultural land for food. We can also use good zero waste policies for dealing with food waste. We can promote healthy food retail environments, but again, that needs to be underpinned by legislation to actually enforce it. But then we can also use one of the policies in NPF4 to restrict hot food takeaways. However, this has been done in England to some considerable success. It's slightly different, and Tracy's mentioned this relationship between planning authorities and health boards, which is a fundamentally different one in England in relation to Scotland, and the two would need to come together much more closely in Scotland to basically collaborate in a way that happens in England, where essentially planning officers are working with their own colleagues in public health on these matters. In Scotland, you would be working with an external organisation. The other role that health can play in this is that health boards, although they are statutory consultees in the planning system, there is still a very detached relationship between them and planning, and often we are negotiating and liaising with health boards on 3 separate issues. We're often dealing with them to discuss where are the infrastructure, where do you need expanded healthcare facilities. That's a different person internally than the same person who will be dealing with the health board's Good Food Nation plan. It'll be a different person entirely who will have never heard of you and won't realise that you've actually been dealing with their colleagues on other issues. You've also then got the provision of GP practices, dental surgeries. Where can I put houses in future where people will be able to reach medical facilities? These are, and in planning, you're constantly firefighting, you're dealing with whatever the biggest issue is at the time, and housing is a very big issue at the time. It's taking up a lot of planners' time. We've also recently had the climate emergency, and our planning policies are adapting to those competing demands. Simply, for this plan to work, for the Good Food Nation plan to work, and the Good Food Nation agenda to work, food needs to get better at shouting, to get up to the top of that list of priorities. And it needs to provide solutions to the planning system that are implementable, using the tools that we have existing as planners, but also proposes solutions that are tools for the future that can actually work.
Brilliant, thank you very much. That's really, really helpful. Mandy, So from your perspective, and I won't ask you to speak for the whole of the third sector, you'll be glad to know, but draw from your perspective what you see as the opportunities that this process is going to offer both to the third sector as well as to the communities you serve.
Yeah, I mean, can I just start on one barrier?
Yeah.
So the overexposure to unhealthy food at the last session, I was listening to the last session, you know, there was a lot of talk about the food and getting people healthy food and access to healthy food, but there's also a stigma attached. There's also a stigma attached to food, and there's this kind of feeling, I think, of, you know, everybody talks about going on a diet, so people know that they need to eat healthier, people know the types of foods that they need to eat when they want to lose a bit of weight. So there is this stigma around healthy food of being diet food rather than being the food that we actually should eat. And I think there's a bit of a message in there that we have to get out into communities, and I think, you know, having hubs within communities to be able to do a lot of that food education, being able to be there as community anchor organisations. Housing was mentioned there, but housing are withdrawing from communities and they're going to their central locations and just working from home, so they're pulling out of local communities. People need employability skills, and you know, the pantries, they support the kind of, as I already said, you know, the food, healthy food, getting healthy food within communities, and just being there because it's your peers as well, because it's a group of your peers. You know, you're working alongside a group of your peers rather than being told from somebody, this is what you must do. So I do think that, you know, pantries have a huge part to play in that.
I'm really struck by a number of things that I think both yourself, Mandy, and Meadhbh have been saying, which really speaks to a sort of place-based, the importance of place and understanding the place. And I do that in inverted commas, but also coming back to the second session around sport as well, and the relationship between green space, the relationship between leisure facilities, the relationship between what schools are able to offer holistically, and how these different aspects come together to create positive living environments and healthy environments, and how we have maybe found ourselves in a position where the environments are just insidiously being eroded in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the facilities, in terms of the anchor institutions. So I think there's something really, really interesting there about, from a local authority perspective, as well as you say, the health board perspective, about really understanding their place and the lived experiences of different individuals and communities and households within that. I was struck by the GPS data that Fran referred to as well. Really interesting about actually, you know, understand what is it like to go to school for different types of kids, rather than us assuming that we think we know what it is actually really understanding those day-to-day realities. In terms of the barriers, Mandy, do you want to start, seeing as you were on a roll there? Do you want to start in terms of the barriers that you feel going forward, and what all of us who are sort of involved in different ways in this process, what we really need to be cognizant of, and we really need to call out and fight against, and as you say, Meadhbh, shout from the rooftops about?
Yeah, I mean, I think just what Meadhbh said there about the planning. Planning has been an issue for us, as well as the Pantry network, you know, getting the council to talk to other council departments. So again, just back to Glasgow City Council, you know, we have a really good food plan. We have, you know, lots of people really wanting to be out there, you know, getting the food plan on the ground. You've got planning who doesn't talk to the other departments, to anybody else, to other departments within the council, and so you've got a council who's saying we really, really want to get this food plan, you know, moving forward. We want to support communities, but actually there is no support to actually get that moving on the ground. Again, you know, overexposure to unhealthy food. So we've got the kind of you know, a strip of shops. There'll be a betting shop, there'll be takeaway shops, and there'll be a 101 that sells mostly alcohol and this kind of a size of a shelf of fruit and veg. And then you've got transport within communities. So particularly the community that I worked within was Rockazy, where I set up the first pantry. You know, people had to take a bus to get to their local community. The bus service was taken off to take them to Easterhouse, so to one shopping centre, and then the bus service was taken off to take people to the other shopping centre, which left people in absolute, I think I heard the word, a food desert, and that's exactly what it was. People just had no access to get to food. So these are a lot of the challenges that are facing communities.
Again, some of the insights I've taken from what I've observed and been involved in is that we do need new ways of working. And I think maybe you've been sort of maybe alluding to some of those in terms of who speaks to who and how we actually support the process of convening and partnering and collaborating, but also of being able to sense check and maybe some of the competition that occurs within institutions and organisations between different teams, so that we can really understand the interconnections and interdependencies across the different outcome areas, as well as within and between policies across them. So Maeve, in terms of thinking about the ways of working and thinking about the ways in which we can evolve how we are doing this type of work, what sort of reflections might you have on that? And how might that help to overcome some of the barriers that you've already discussed?
Well, I think it's actually been very encouraging to listen to some of the challenges and barriers that are being faced with things like the HFSS advertising, some of the loopholes, the placement of unhealthy products. Those problems that are encountered when you finally have your policy running and you realise, we didn't think of that. That's what every planning policy has. Our open space guidance, if it's not written properly, developers will not produce any open space worth visiting. If our housing in the countryside guidance isn't robust, speculative applications for housing, which will never get built, will come in from all angles. Every policy that we could possibly use to determine a planning application has to deal with those same loopholes and problems. And it takes very experienced people to deal with lots of different stakeholders to come up with wording that everyone can agree with. And planners are very guarded about who we're simply not in an era anymore where we have the free time to give advice to individuals. And often the third sector takes the brunt of that because they could really do with a bit of steer as to what they're trying to do, which is ultimately for the public good. But planners, ultimately, their diaries are often full for weeks in advance, trying to come up with solutions which, as I said, will achieve a long-term use of land that's in everyone's public interest. Now, the retail environment being identified as a poor with the betting shops and alcohol, I appreciate that, and I think that's actually very characteristic of when planning has tried to take a short-term view to helping out the retail sector, which at one point was shouting very loudly, and basically directed a policy of trying to get all our retail concentrated in clustered centres that had to be identified on the plan. And if you wanted to have a retail opportunity outside that, you had to justify that you weren't going to detract from town centre vitality. What that has actually caused is huge areas of land that can't, where people can't walk to anything to access daily needs. And I'd like to think that National Planning Framework 4 has actually reversed that a little bit with the policy on local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods. We now can support things that actually contribute to the vitality at local level outside of designated town centres, and there's no longer that need for this identified hierarchy of commercial and retail centres. So we've accepted now that there's simply no way to resuscitate retail in town centres. It is transitioning. It needs greater diversity of spaces and anchor institutions, like you've said. And I think if planning could go back to taking the long-term view and not, I suppose, dealing with the short-term pressures, then we would actually come up with solutions that are, better. But I think our view of what the public interest, that needs to be challenged and needs to encompass public health. That is the greatest way we can make a better contribution to not just obesity, but also other campaigns related to alcohol exposure and other harms from the commercial determinants of health. If public interest, because advertising consent regulations and a whole host of other planning legislation considers amenity and public interest, but public interest stops short of public health in planning terms. If that could be confirmed, expanded, given legislative teeth, that would really give planners across the country a lot to work with.
Really, really interesting, and it's given a huge amount of food for thought, I think. And also, in the interactions I'm having so far, we are getting planners coming to the table, or at least representatives from those departments. But it's clear from what you're saying how important it is that both you're there at the table, both to contribute, but also to be influenced by the range of views that are going on. It's now time to move, so thank you so much for those questions and for working through and riffing with me a little bit. So now it's time to open it up to you in the floor and give you opportunities to ask the panel questions about Good Food Nation, the Good Food Nation process, and what you envisage for delivery going forward. There's a question right up the back there.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel there. That was really interesting discussion. My name's Jenny Gillespie. I used to work in NHS Tayside and am currently working for Education Scotland. And then my previous role, I actually worked within public health. We did quite a lot of work around kind of whole systems approaches and trying to address kind of complex challenges, which you've all just kind of highlighted really closely there. I was interested, Maeve, in your last point around about the real importance and the need to incorporate public health into that kind of public interest. The challenges that exist at a local level to actually make that happen always come down to the resource and how much funding do we get, ring-fence funding, to be able to have people who can coordinate, have a role there to coordinate and to try and join the dots between all those different disciplines that need to come together. So my point in this is just to understand where are we at in terms of enabling there to be resource at a local level to start using already existing networks that are in place, or to try and form new networks. So it's about the resource that's going to come, hopefully, through the Good Food Nation, but I don't know where we're at with that, the availability of that. So I don't know if that's to Tracy or to another.
Thank you. Maeve, do you want to start in terms of from your experience in terms of the role or the reimagining of resources at a local level to try and drive some of that more coordination?
I certainly don't know how health and local resources could be done. I know that the changes to the ring fencing of planning application fees to actually stay within the plan, to pay for the planning department, that has been enacted in Scotland. It's still being rolled out. We're still at very much a transition for that. But that essentially is quite a game-changing policy. It enables us to then have some ability to ring-fence that money that is caused by planning applications to actually pay for resourcing the system so that policies can be better, more ambitious, more resourced and more evidence-based. A lot of the problem with the justifying a really ambitious and very different planning policy from what you've had before, and with food retail this would be the case, is having the evidence base to justify it. You know, you can't refuse an application for something unhealthy in a specific town on a specific street because nationally obesity levels are as high as they are. It needs to be evidence that there's a specific problem in this town and that specific development will make it worse. Local authorities, the onus is on them to demonstrate it, and they simply don't have that baseline to work with. So the resources needs to pay for a significant evidence base, and the new local development plan system is really evidence-led compared to what we were working with before. So I would like to see that result in a better evidence base, but then you also need to monitor. As soon as you've got your policies in place, you need to be able to show, well, actually we are making a difference, or in some instances we're not making a difference, the policy could be improved again. So I'd like to think that the planning systems ring fencing of fees could do something better. But I'm not even sure that is enough, given just, again, how complex a lot of the sort of nature of demands that we're dealing with from many, many different angles. I'm not really sure about how health would be necessarily funded in that way.
And what we're doing, and the reason why I put my head above the parapet with the Wellcome Trust project and sort of try and leverage that money into Scotland was to try and provide a sort of agile, diverse level of resource that could support individual and/or groups of relevant authorities. And we're beginning to get really good momentum around that. So there's multiple groupings of local authorities and health boards who are obviously geographically and strategically aligned, who we are beginning to work with to help with some of that initial preparing to plan. So they're in the pre-preparation stages, and it's so much about trying to get the different voices, different departments, different perspectives in the room. It's about trying to make sense of what you already know, what already is happening within a relevant authority or a collection of relevant authorities, and how that then can lead to, and I wanted to pick up on this, the development of, and I think Maeve, you said it, an ambitious vision for what food means to each and every relevant authority of the 46 of them, but also how that needs to be phased and tempered with the reality and the practicalities of the timeframes and the resources involved. Because Dennis Overton has said this multiple times in public, the new chair of the Scottish Food Commission, that this is a decadal process. He doesn't say how many decades, and he doesn't say how many of us will be around to sort of see some of the fruits of its labour. But it's that sense of how we are approaching the start of this process will really matter, I think, as we evolve the partnerships and the collaborations and leverage what might be creative ways of using existing resources, or understand the interconnections and interdependencies so that we can get a multiplier effect. I think the other thing that really sticks out for me at times as well is that we can get very focused on trying to prove that a policy works. When actually it's a basket or a collection of policies that interact with each other. So I think we might need to be a bit kinder to ourselves sometimes, that not every policy is going to deliver an overwhelming outcome, but the collection of them and the relationship between them is something that really matters. So I hope that gets to that. And I've about 20 seconds. Well, I'll give one more question. And I'm going to apologise, I have to run for a train, which won't be very pretty. So if I look like I'm escaping the building, I am, but I have a commitment in Edinburgh that I need to get back for, so I really apologise for running out the door. But please go.
Hi, I'm Louisa Walker from NHS Lothian, and just following up from Jenny's comment, in Lothian we've actually got partnership in place teams within public health who work very closely in the planning. And a wee bit of good news this year is that we've managed to actually write the health and wellbeing schedule as part of the LDP2 for some of the local authorities. But being involved with whole systems work for children over the last few years and looking at this, and also colleagues, and I hate to make a comparison of the alcohol industry and planning applications that keep getting knocked back, my plea would be that if an application is looked at around the evidence, that we've got systems in place that it just doesn't get knocked back or ignored all the time. Because we're finding that in the alcohol world where there's over-provision, and we do have the evidence around alcohol admissions, and if we want to do something different with food and health without policing, because we can't police people either, that needs to be strengthened for local authorities to take it to task.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take that as a sort of reflection to end on, but I think it's a really... Did you want to respond?
Yeah, I would agree with particularly commitments to the colleagues in Lothian, particularly Mid-Lothian Council produced that very excellent health schedule within their evidence report for the LDP. It stands out relative to other evidence reports, and it really has set a very high bar as to what kind of evidence base you can produce to justify and rely on later when you're trying to develop good planning policy. And it's certainly set a good example for myself trying to produce local development plan in local government. So on the alcohol issue, it is slightly separate, and I know you've a train to run for. But yes, we do certainly work quite closely with colleagues in licensing, particularly who deal with the over-provision aspect with alcohol. And yes, there's similar frustrations there with the use class order, not really accounting for the diversity of retail environments there. But very well made points.
It's a very interesting point, as you say, about the sort of evidence bar, but also about why the status quo can be allowed to continue, even though we have the wealth of data around that. So really interesting, and also that sense of good practice and being able to be open to and willing to learn from each other, which is exactly what you're saying. Can we give a round of applause to the panel? Thank you very much.